Welcome to the Andrew Wyeth Lecture in American Art here at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, National Gallery of Art. My name is Peter Lucard. I'm interim dean here at the center, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce today's lecturer, Jennifer Robb, professor in the Department of Art History at Yale University. Before doing so, I would like to acknowledge the important institutions and individuals who have helped to make this event possible. First, we are grateful to the Andrew Wyeth Foundation for American Art for their continued support since 2003 of the lecture and symposium series, which take place in alternating years. The Wyeth Foundation also supports predoctoral fellowships, and we are pleased to see current and former recipients in the room with us today. At the center, we wish to thank Associate Dean Kyra Cabañas, Elise Verone, Gary Calcagno, Jen Rakowski, and Messeret Ogira for their thoughtful assistance and with 1,000 details that make for successful programs. We are also grateful to our wonderful colleagues at Joyful Signing, Kelly Grant, Jennifer Olson, and Ali Bebmanish, excuse me for my pronunciation there, who will interpret the lecture. Behind the scenes, we extend our appreciation to Devin Harris and Zoe Lucas, and in visitor experiences to Tim Turner and Brennan Chofi Upchurch. This year, we introduced a visual description of the participants in our lectures. I'm a white male with a smattering of white hair and hazel eyes. I'm wearing a suit with a white shirt and vintage tie, though not quite a Civil War relic. Standing at the podium, which is adjacent to the projection screen with a striking image by Brady and Company of relics of Andersonville Prison from June 1866, which is part of the collection of the Metropolitan. Jennifer Robb is having quite a remarkable year. Her most recent book, The Relics of War, The History of a Photograph, published in 2024, just received the Charles Rufus Morey Book Award from the College Art Association in 2026, which was announced at the annual meeting last month. And within the next month, a new volume, Frederick Church Global Artist, co-edited with Tim Berenger and Elizabeth Kornhauser, will issue from Yale University Press and Olana State Historic Site. We will return to her research in just a minute, but first we need to know a bit about how she got to this point. Jennifer received her BA from Stanford University and her PhD from Yale in 2009. She began teaching at Yale as an assistant professor in 2013 and moved steadily through the ranks to full professor in 2025. Her honors and awards include dissertation research fellowships from the Paul Mellon Center, Yale Center for British Art, the Luce Foundation, the Terra Foundation, the Wyeth Foundation, and Dumbarton Oaks. Her postdoctoral awards include a Betsy Main Babcock Fellowship at Ranolda House, a research fellowship at the John F. Kennedy Institute at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and an A.W. Mellon Fellowship at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. Jennifer's first book, Frederick Church, The Art and Science of Detail, 2015, offered the first sustained examination of the aesthetics of detail that fundamentally shaped 19th century American landscape painting and is inseparable from scientific discourses of the time. It was extremely well received with glowing reviews in the Art Bulletin and the Journal of American Studies, among others. It was followed by an exhibition catalog concerning picturesque and sublime, Thomas Cole's Transatlantic Inheritance in 2018, again co-edited with Tim Berenger, this time with Gillian Forrester. The exhibition addressed the picturesque, which emphasized touristic pleasures and visual delight, and the sublime, an aesthetic category rooted in notions of fear and danger. Jennifer has published widely on American art and culture. In addition to the volumes already mentioned, she has written about panoramic vision, telegraphic language, Selling the American West, 1868 to 1884, in the Journal of American Studies in 2013. Also, precisely these objects, Frederick Church and the Culture of Detail, was published in the Art Bulletin, which is the, if you are not already aware, the bulletin of record for the College Art Association. Metamorphoses for the exhibition catalog, Mathew Barney, Redoubt in 2019, and The Art of Alchemy, Golden Pictures, or Turning Extractive Capitalism into American Individualism, in El Dorado, a reader. Okay, we'll wait for Big Ben to stop. Okay. In 2024.
A nice chat.
Right. That's me. As promised, I wish to return to Jennifer's prize-winning volume, Relics of War, The History of a Photograph, as some of its most important ideas also underpin today's lecture. It was singled out by Kirk Savage, himself a Wyeth lecturer, in 2015, and a noted art historian who has a lot to say about the Civil War. He praised the book as full of profound insight and moral weight by telling the story of Clara Barton's photograph and the rough-hewn objects shown within it. Jennifer Robb reveals how it functions variously as memory, witness, and indictment. We now look forward to Jennifer's new thoughts on the role of photographs as records of violence, mourning, advocacy, and inequity. They bear witness to the complexity of responses to and experiences of the Civil War. In her paper, The Evidence of History, Photographs of the Civil War. Please join me in welcoming Jennifer Robb to the podium.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that incredibly thoughtful and generous introduction. Thank you again to the Wyeth Foundation for their support for this lecture and all else in the field. And again, to my colleagues at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, including Peter Kyra Cabañas, and especially Elise Ferrone for so much logistical work in the months and weeks that have passed. And my thanks to all of you, including colleagues, friends, and family, for spending this beautiful spring afternoon inside a dark lecture hall or watching at your computer. I hope you can enjoy some early cherry blossom buds as after we look at some really fascinating early photographs. So let's begin. Photography is perhaps most closely associated with evidence. Evidence that something happened, that it looked a certain way, that someone was there. Nearly 200 years after its invention, we often look to photography as evidence of the past, as historical documents, as a way to make contact with people and places across the insurmountable distance of time. And although early photographs could not capture action, they offer extraordinary detail, an invitation, it would seem, to look, to feel, to know. Photographs of the American Civil War are especially resonant. This was the deadliest war in U.S. history, with 750,000 dying, 3% of the population, more than in all other American wars combined. It is often considered the first modern war, reliant on new modes of mechanization, communication, and transportation. The first widespread use of heavy artillery contributed to the staggering destruction and casualties. Half the dead were unnamed, their bodies unidentifiable. Meanwhile, new technology, photography, the telegraph, the railroad, made the war accessible to the public in a way that no prior conflict of this scale had been. The war could be seen by those far from its battlefields. 1,500 photographers produced tens of thousands of images of the Civil War. Today, I'd like to consider several of the most canonical, by Mathew Brady, Alexander Gardner, and Timothy O'Sullivan, and others, here's a few of the most canonical, and others much less well-known. What can these photographs tell us about how conflict, violence, and military service are represented? How is life and death portrayed? While we are now so accustomed to seeing images of dead bodies, that was not the case in 1861 when the Civil War began. And when the war ended, the question became, how might the missing be made visible and mourned? When there was no body, what might stand in its stead? Clara Barton, who would later found the American Red Cross, addressed these questions in her political and philanthropic work. A photograph of relic objects, which she collected from the notorious Confederate Civil War prison camp at Andersonville, Georgia, radically reimagines what the evidence of history could be. The idea of the war photographer and even a photograph of war was a relatively new one in 1861. The man who rushed to embody this was Mathew Brady. And I mean rushed quite literally. The first battle of the American Civil War was fought at Bull Run on July 21st. Brady hurried to get there in the days before, a portrait photographer eager for battlefield images, traveling from Washington, D.C. with a group of more than 24 newspaper correspondents. He did not travel lightly. 19th century photography was an intensely material endeavor, dependent on hundreds of pounds of supplies, cameras, tripods, lenses, glass plates, bottles and trays, chemicals and solutions, water, and wagons to carry it all, and to serve as portable darkrooms. At Bull Run, the Union suffered a sobering defeat, followed by a panicked and chaotic retreat, a first indication that the war would not be short. Brady was forced to abandon his wagons. His glass negatives were destroyed. No photographs by him or anyone else survived the battle. He returned to his studio unnerved, but staged a portrait of himself that claims otherwise. Here he is striking a confident pose. He wears a sword, the hilt visible at his side, muddy boots, and a long duster coat, hem darkened by grime. Engagement, rather than detached observation, is the visual effect. To document is no easy thing, the photograph aims to show. And the handwritten caption gives us the place and time. Brady, the photographer, returned from Bull Run, photo taken July 22nd, 1861, the day after the battle. The variously angled lettering squeezed in at the edges and the shorthand word photo, rare for the time, all create a sense of haste and action, as if to offer an alternative for the actual event that did not appear in any photographs. The portrait stands as evidence that Brady was there and returned. That is to say, he was a witness and survived. And with this picture, he produces a new type, the courageous war photographer, even if he may look, to our eyes, more like a Parisian art student. Canvas, drop cloths gathered at his feet, a jaunty cravat around his neck, a straw hat donned for some plein air sketching. After this, Brady would leave the work of capturing the war to the photographers he employed in his successful studio business. When the Battle of Antietam was fought on September 17, 1862, the single bloodiest day of the conflict with 23,000 casualties and no clear victor, Alexander Gardner was sent to photograph the aftermath. These photographs were exhibited at Brady's gallery in New York City, engraved and published in the press, and sold as cabinet cards and stereographs. They depicted the war as never before. The dead lie scattered about amidst the rolling farmlands of Maryland, a wagon or a house sometimes joining them. In others, they can be seen in the sunken dirt road that would become known as Bloody Lane, where many fell and were later buried. In this image, a line of bodies occupies one side of the frame, beginning in the center foreground and curving out to a point at the left edge before turning back to the center again, forming a kind of boomerang shape, a geometric dynamism at odds with the immobility of the dead. Following the chaos of battle, the deceased have been neatly arranged, as if mustered into formation for their last roll call. The arrangement does not appear to have any immediate relationship to the requirements of burial. The earth remains unbroken around these bodies, and where and how they will be put into the ground is unclear. Here they are instead laid out for view, to be seen by those they fought against on this very field, and to be seen as a photograph by the Northern public. There is a morbid military geometry at work that attempts to make order of violence and that presents a sense of dutiful service, as much a commentary on the Union troops who respectfully made these lines of bodies as about their fallen Southern adversaries. The audience for these images would have been accustomed to seeing soldiers standing erect in uniform, caps on their heads, weapons by their side. Countless such photographs were taken in cities and towns across the United States as boys and men enlisted, or just before they went into battle, ducking into a simple canvas tent that served as a makeshift portrait studio near the front lines, where cheap, sturdy, and lightweight tintype could be made and sent home to loved ones, evidence of being alive, at least at that moment. Other soldiers chose to sit before the camera before they left home. In this rare and extraordinary image, an African-American soldier sits for his portrait with his family. 200,000 Black men enlisted and served in the Union Army and Navy. An estimated 2/3 had been enslaved before the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. This man is in uniform, his wife beside him in a dress and bonnet, his 2 daughters wearing matching coats and hats. The photograph documents their presence, but more than that, it is an assertion of rights. Here, this Black man asserts his right to be photographed in the manner of his choosing, his right to have and keep together his family, something that chattel slavery routinely denied, his right to serve his nation and wear its military uniform. This small image is such a powerful act of world building under excruciating circumstances. Facing deployment, separation from his family, and possible death, the photograph captures incredible moments of touch. The tips of the man's fingers tenderly grazing the cuff of his daughter's coat. The other daughter anxiously clutching a handful of her mother's skirts. The woman resting one hand flat atop the other, as if to quiet her nerves. This is an ambrotype. Like a daguerreotype, it is a single, unique photograph. The glass plate is exposed and fixed. There are no copies, no circulation in the world. It is made for one person or family to keep in one place. It is made to hold. By contrast, photographs of statesmen and military commanders proliferated at this time. They were made to shape public opinion. Abraham Lincoln was enamored with the new medium and often had his portrait taken. Early in his career, he had grasped the power of photography. During his first campaign, he sat for his portrait at Mathew Brady's studio. The photograph, which then appeared in posters and advertisements, was essential in cultivating a presidential persona, countering the critique that he was a coarse, unpredictable man from the backwoods of Illinois. With not a hair out of place, grave expression on his face, pressed suit, the barest hint of a classical column, hand resting upon books, this was evidence of honest Abe. Brady opened his gallery on Broadway in New York shortly before the Civil War began and used it as a space to display portraits of presidents and celebrities in the heart of Manhattan's commercial district. Here was a place to see photographs as well as sit for them. The setting was parlor-like, plush furniture, dimpled velvet banquettes, elaborate light fixtures. In a word, aspirational. So when a little placard outside the door announced a new installation of photographs, The Dead of Antietam, the effect was startlingly dissonant. Crowds of people gathered to view a radically different kind of exhibition, not portraits of illustrious Americans, but photographs from the battlefield taken by Alexander Gardner. You will see, the New York Times reported, hushed, reverend groups standing around these weird copies of carnage, bending down to look in the pale faces of the dead, chained by the strange spell that dwells in dead men's eyes. These pictures have a terrible distinctness. By the aid of the magnifying glass, the very features of the slain may be distinguished. If distinctness was what photography could offer as proof of life, it could also function as proof of death. We would scarce choose to be in the gallery, the article concluded, when one of the women bending over them should recognize a husband, a son, or a brother in the still, lifeless lines of bodies. What death in wartime actually looked like was undeniably grotesque, unfamiliar to all but the battlefield veteran. History painting was the artistic genre traditionally tasked with representing conflict. In John Trumbull's Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill, death was clean, narratives of sacrifice and honor apparent, opposing sides clearly distinguishable. The canvas offers a soaring space for heroic gestures. The dying man, a Christ-like figure posed like Michelangelo's Pietà, illuminated by a raking light. Other dead bodies and minor characters consigned to the shadows. Animated clusters of clouds and a perfectly calibrated wind lift the eyes to the drama of flags and atmosphere. Gardner's photographs give us real bodies and nameless ordinary men. War was not an opportunity for allegory. The Civil War did not produce grand manner history painting as had the Revolution. Albert Bierstadt's 1862 canvas, the same year as Gardner's Antietam photographs, makes an effort to bring action to landscape. But despite the title, Guerrilla Warfare, the painting is mostly golden light and arboreal refuge. There's a comforting slowness about the composition, as if to encourage the eye to contemplate the meandering road above the white farmhouse in the distance, rather than the puff of smoke from one soldier's rifle. We are not shown what actually happens in the field between. Engravings printed in weekly illustrated newspapers drew closer to the bodies, but still eschewed the distressing particularities of wartime death and suffering until later in the conflict. Even the engraved translations of Gardner's Antietam photographs, which appeared in this full-page spread in Harper's Weekly at the same time as the photographs themselves were on view in Brady's gallery, lacked the specifically shocking details. The bridge over Antietam Creek, the site of a particularly long and ferocious engagement between Confederate sharpshooters and Union infantry, occupies the largest and most central space of the layout and features only 2 patrolling soldiers amid an otherwise serene scene. The overall effect is a kind of pastoral stillness, as if this landscape, scrubbed of the human debris of battle and without the explicit signs of trampled and scorched earth, had already been turned into a sacred place, where bodies had come to rest in a place of church-like quiet that bore no overt signs of violence. In the engraver's interpretation of the photograph of bodies arranged for burial, slight changes enable this tonal shift. The row has been centered to create a more symmetrical composition in the print. The boomerang shape has become a gentle arc, echoed by the billowy clouds above. The bodies blur into a repetitive similarity. The singed and scrubby grass is rendered unremarkable as a series of quick lines and areas of shade. A stone wall has been added and defines the middle ground. A far hill and another large tree now mark the background. The sky consumes far more of the picture. If the photograph brings the dead close, the print keeps its distance. Less than a year after Antietam, arguably the most famous photograph of the war was taken following a battle waged on a wheat field in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Timothy O'Sullivan's A Harvest of Death. Two details lend the image its particular charge. One is the spectral figure on horseback in the hazy depths of the picture. Like a grim reaper come to take these souls away, he offers a symbolic framework through which to approach the image, especially in light of the photograph's title. The background encourages generalization, the horseman as death. In the foreground, the other detail, the face of the central figure rendered in devastatingly crisp focus, eludes symbolism entirely and instead confronts us with time's marked effects on the body. Eyes squeezed shut, lips swollen, mouth agape. On his feet, we see only socks. Shoes were always among the first things scavenged by the living from the dead. These men had been lying on the field for days. Burial required time, troops, and resources. And as the war entered its third year, even the most basic rituals of death became difficult, if not impossible, to perform. Clara Barton would directly address this problem after the war. When Gardner later published O'Sullivan's image in his photographic sketchbook of the war, 2 volumes of 50 photographs, each with a short text that spanned the conflict, he chose to place A Harvest of Death 1/3 of the way through as plate 36. The previous plates feature ruined buildings, scenes of troops, and various aspects of military life and infrastructure. Nothing prepares the viewer for this photograph. Here are the dreadful details, the text exclaims. Let them aid in preventing such another calamity falling upon the nation. To consecrate the cemetery at Gettysburg on November 19th, 1863, Abraham Lincoln uttered what would become the most famous speech of the war and arguably in the whole of American history. After Edward Everett's 2-hour keynote oratory, Lincoln rose to deliver his 3-minute address. If Everett gave the rhetorical equivalent of a whole cycle of large-scale history paintings, Lincoln gave an address that has a certain photographic sensibility. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. Lincoln's speech has a precision and specificity, a focus on the field on which they stood that day, the field that O'Sullivan had captured after battle. His insistent use of the word here also aligns his language with the indexical nature of photography. This one-syllable word, which he repeats like an incantation, turns a field into a sacred site and a sacred site into a collective resolution. There is no I in the speech, only they in the past and we in the present. Where the dead and the living meet, where devotion is given in blood and renewed in language, is here. As Lincoln delivered his famous address, townspeople sold relics from the battle on tables set up on the surrounding sidewalks. When a monument was erected there after the war, an article about its unveiling featured not only an engraving of the 60-foot high classical column with an allegorical figure of liberty atop it, but 2 facing images depicting the gathering and selling of relics. Soldiers and civilians alike were consumed by collecting objects from battlefields and other sites of war: bullet shells, bits of cloth, pieces of wood and metal. Such objects were most often referred to as relics, intimately connected with the body, and served as small fragmentary reminders of the horrors that had occurred, At Gettysburg alone, there were approximately 50,000 casualties over 3 days. An object from the site of death marked a presence, a way to hold what had been here. Immediately following the Civil War, interest in relics surged. Relics related to the Lincoln assassination were especially valued, including bits of blood-stained fabric that had dressed Lincoln's wounds as he lay dying, mounted and inscribed with their authenticating stories. Relics from the prisoner of war camp at Andersonville became particularly famous. Mere months after the Confederacy's surrender at Appomattox in April 1865, Clara Barton traveled from Washington, D.C. to Andersonville, Georgia, to the site of the infamous Confederate prison, where 45,000 men had been incarcerated and nearly 13,000 died. The town began as a tiny railroad depot and was turned into the largest Confederate POW facility in the final year of the war, primarily because of its remote location far from the front lines and because of the availability of enslaved labor. Enslaved people cleared the land, dug the earthworks, built the stockade, and later buried the dead. The open-air stockade was designed to contain 10,000 people at most, but the prison population quickly multiplied many times over, as this later print depicts, making Andersonville the 5th largest city in the South. 1/3 of the men died within 7 months of arrival, and 40% of those who came through the prison perished. Barton initiated an army expedition to this city of the dead, arranged by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and including Dorrance Atwater, a former Andersonville prisoner who would become Barton's close collaborator. The group carried 7,000 unlettered headboards and fencing to construct a proper cemetery, which Barton presided over its consecration, as this little detail shows. Barton and her companions endured the long and arduous journey to southern Georgia during the heat of the summer, passing through the ruins of Atlanta and Macon so that they could identify the missing and deceased, count the numbers, record the names, and notify their families. But this was not all they did there. She and Atwater also collected objects left behind by those thousands of men who had lived and died on a mere 26 acres of land. These were, she wrote in her diary, the Andersonville relics. When she returned from Andersonville, Barton advocated for a new government agency to aid in the search for missing soldiers. At 7th and E Streets, merely a few blocks from where we sit right now, she established the Office of Correspondence with the Friends of the Missing Men of the United States Army, known in short form as the Missing Soldiers Office. Here she lived and worked, and with the help of a small staff, undertook a vast and systematic epistolary project. During the last year of the war, Barton wrote in a report to Congress, I became aware from letters received from various parts of the country that a very large number of our soldiers had disappeared from view without leaving behind them any visible trace or record, end quote. To address this grim mystery, Barton responded to more than 63,000 letters with 41,000 of her own, identifying more than 22,000 men and naming all but 450 of the more than 13,000 who had died and were buried at Andersonville. Although most famously known as a nurse, her background as a recording clerk at the U.S. Patent Office in the decade before the war enabled her to undertake a project that arguably had far wider and more historically significant consequences than her medical care could ever have provided. She composed a standardized reply so that letters of inquiry could be responded to quickly and efficiently. The official form letter contains a long blank space where a name could be written in and assumes a female reader. Dear Madam. While the dead were men, the writers were women. The act of naming was not just a means for families to recover a sense of when and where a loved one died. It played a crucial role in ensuring the welfare, essentially the lives, of the women and children left behind. A law passed in 1862 provided pensions for widows, as well as mothers and dependent sisters of deceased soldiers, but required significant documentation of the dead in order to claim these benefits. This was frequently impossible. The modern weaponry introduced during the Civil War often injured bodies beyond recognition. Sometimes, as Barton wrote, they simply disappeared. Barton was adamant about the government's responsibility towards its soldiers and its veterans, living and dead. Conscription legislation was passed for the first time in the nation's history in 1863. If citizenship now entailed a contractual obligation to fight for white men of a certain age, then it should, she felt, entail certain reciprocal rights for the soldier and his family. In 1863, African American men could enlist as well, although citizenship would not be granted until 1868 with the ratification of the 14th Amendment. As the Union ranks grew, so too did the numbers of missing and dead. In her appeal to the Secretary of War for funding to search for the missing, she reminded him that, quote, "These poor men have lost not only their lives, but the very record of their death. Common humanity would plead that an effort be made to restore their identity. Never has wife or mother agreed that for the destruction of her treasures, no account should be rendered her." Barton's insistence on identification and on compensation asserts the rights not only of the citizen soldier, but also of their wives, mothers, and sisters, as Drew Gilpin Faust has argued in her seminal book on death and the American Civil War. In an era when women were legally denied the ability to enter into contracts, Barton's advocacy sought to posthumously extend the rights of the soldier to his heirs. Relics of Andersonville is the visual site for this work. There are no bodies shown, no proper names given. Such conventional markers of identity are absent. While Barton attempted to identify the missing by name, the photograph admits that this may be impossible, that no trace of a body might be found, that no evidence of death might be forthcoming, and that such absence should also have a certain agency in this contractual space. If a wife had waited and her husband had not returned, what other explanation was there? Should she not still receive the pension and account for the destruction of her treasures, as Barton had phrased it, in a rather brilliant elision of quantitative and sentimental language? Relics of Andersonville makes an ethical as well as a legislative appeal. It speaks for those who did not have a political voice or vote. This image of deprivation and subsistence makes a case for the disenfranchised that is inseparable from the legislative advocacy that Clara Barton undertook. Not finding a system, she creates one. Not finding a policy, she proposes one. Not finding bodies, she collects relic objects in their stead, exhibits them, and has them photographed, and in so doing asks the spectator, as well as the state, what responsibility they bear to those who could not be named. Let's take a closer look at this photograph, which was produced as both a large format print and a smaller calling card size photograph meant for distribution. Here are whittled wooden spoons, woven reed plates, crude baking dishes small enough to be cradled in the palm of the hand, cups fashioned from animal horns. One of the first things one notices is the somewhat crude handwritten labels attached to each object. Here we are told as we read each one is the stuff of daily life: plate, bucket, cup, Bible, as well as things that speak to scarcity and violence. Bones for soup found in stockade, shell from fort, Andersonville deadline, the latter a wooden fence, monitored by armed guards from watchtowers above, that prisoners were prohibited from crossing on pain of death. A numbered grave marker labeled headboard is placed below it. At the bottom of this configuration is the Andersonville mailbox, A piece of wood about 2.5 feet tall with a small rectangular hole where letters, not to exceed 1 page, might be deposited to await censorship and often confiscation in the rare event that paper and ink were available at all. At the scale of the carte de visite, which measures 2.5 by 4 inches, many of the labels are very difficult to decipher, even with a magnifying glass. But the work of naming is clearly central to the image, as if to declare that visual recognition alone might be insufficient or impossible, and thus that each relic must be marked most prominently by a word or set of terms. Yet there is also a startling dissonance between text and object. Is that really a baking pan? And that a plate? Without these words, which have been literally glued to their objects, the relics would be indicative, most immediately, of deprivation. With the words, simple, direct, unemotional nouns, they become more disturbing, the distance between name and thing much more pronounced. Crowning the display is a round checkerboard fashioned from the cover of a barrel. The game board simultaneously evokes a halo, particularly those flat spheres that hover behind holy figures and angels in Gothic and early Renaissance paintings. And it appears like a head, balancing atop the ungainly anthropomorphic form below, with soup bones rather than saints' bones at the heart. A pocket Bible appears at the upper left of the display, spread open. Although the text cannot be discerned in the image, the Bible, a tiny, fragile artifact stitched together with various densities of thread, indicative of continual use and continual repair, is held in Clara Barton's archive at Smith College. Leviticus 13 through 24 and Numbers 1 through 7 are the only chapters that remain. Leviticus concerns disease, sin, sacrifice, law, and atonement. In Numbers, God commands Moses in the wilderness of Sinai to make an accounting. Take the numbers of their names. Every male older than 1 month in each tribe is counted, as are those above the age of 20 and able to go to war. These delicate pages contain instructions for arranging holy items and offerings, bread on a table together with the dishes and the spoons and the bowls, things not unlike those pictured in the photograph. These verses and chapters from the Old Testament speak directly to suffering, numbering, naming, and war. The Civil War denied deeply rooted religious and cultural rituals of mourning and dying, including what was known as the good death. Since the 15th century, the tradition of ars moriendi, the art of dying, offered a model of dying well, how to pray, repent, release one's worldly attachments, give oneself to God, and apparently here, avoid the wild rumpus of sinful demons lurking at one's deathbed. The sight of death was also crucial. Ideally, one would die in the home, surrounded by close family and friends, perhaps a small phalanx of angels, those people who could then narrate these last moments and testify to the character of the deceased as he or she left the physical world. A robust culture of prints emerged in the 19th century to simulate the act of witnessing and to illustrate the process of mourning for a wide audience. In Currier and Ives, the soldier's grave, an intricately carved tombstone is situated in a lush landscape, framed above by a weeping willow tree and below by the human equivalent, a weeping widow with a bowed head and a long flowing veil. The columns of the tombstone are entirely covered with military and patriotic iconography. A profusion of roses in full bloom flanks the gravestone on the left, alluding to a life taken at its prime. With blank lines to fill in, families could quite literally give a name to the tomb's face. Name, regiment, and place and date of death could be inscribed on this lithograph, the very work that Clara Barton was doing at Andersonville on those 7,000 blank headboards, which replaced the numbered grave markers that she had found there. She took with her number 7,606, which had marked the grave of Sergeant Darius Starr, who died at Andersonville on September 2nd, 1864. In her rooms on 7th Street, which are now a small museum, I encourage you all to go there, Barton arranged her relics. In her drawing room, where she received politicians and journalists, as well as families searching for loved ones, she exhibited these small, simple things in a cabinet so that visitors would, to use her words, at once enter into the spirit of my enterprise. She displayed them at a national fair to benefit soldiers and sailors' orphans, as this carte de visite caption states. And she had them photographed, which Mathew Brady's studio produced and circulated. She carried them with her as she gave lectures across the country. They appeared in an article about her advocacy work alongside her portrait in Harper's Weekly. The relics could, the writer stated, give definite form and substance to what before was in many cases vague. In the 19th century, as with earlier periods, a relic was understood to be a material index, a physical conduit to another time and place. The relic acted as a witness to a past that was unrecoverable or to a person who was no longer living. It was also a site of power rather than a representation of it. In other words, the value of most relics was not recognizable by their outward appearance, not attached to any economic system of commodities and exchange, but rather dependent on language and labeling to name what would appear to be banal, a mere piece of wood or bone, as something of far greater significance. Saints' relic cards were in wide circulation during the 19th century. Here is Saint Veronica, who holds up her veil on which Jesus' image was imprinted when she wiped his face on the way to the crucifixion. The cloth itself has a photographic quality, a direct positive, not a representation, an icon made by human hands. Such cards featured not only a picture of the saint and a text about his or her particular miracles, but often a tiny bit of cloth as well that had touched the saint's relics. A portable, if secondary, haptic connection to the divine called a contact relic. Saints' cards were the same size as carte de visite photographs, scaled to be held and lived with, put into a pocket, grasped in times of distress. Although the term relic is most readily associated with saints' bones and much earlier religious objects, the etymology of the word, the Latin reliqui, does not in fact propose a religious connection, meaning residue, remainder, or that which is left behind. The Latin root helps us to understand the Andersonville objects as relics. They are, quite literally, things that were left behind. They are unremarkable, very often true with religious relics, but they were not associated with a miraculous event or with a holy figure. And without such devotional specificity, they can more easily encompass entire categories: Andersonville prisoners, missing soldiers, the Civil War dead. These anonymous remainders are a means to process loss and grief, enable memory, embody martyrdom, and are arranged here for the camera as an altar or shrine. If the possession of relics in the Western Christian tradition was a precondition for the consecration of churches, what interests me about this image is how the relics from Andersonville consecrate the photograph as a sacred space. While the relic object cannot be copied, its power originating from its direct connection to place or body, the photograph of relics addresses this dilemma by producing an indexical registration of the relic's presence on the light-sensitive photographic negative from which paper prints are made. The photograph is also staged as a kind of inverted reliquary. The sacred objects are not hidden inside, but laid out for view on the stepped and papered shelves. These relics are the remainders of lives that were lost and deaths marked by pain, the stuff of any saint's story. As she worked to name the missing, Clara Barton had these relics photographed, and in doing so, made the dead visible without picturing bodies or graves, offering the photograph itself as a form of contact relic. If the photograph speaks in a secularized language of saints and martyrs, it also implies that there are people who must be held responsible for their deaths. The 1865 court-martial of Captain Henry Wirtz, the Confederate commandant in charge of Andersonville, was the most prominent trial of a Southern officer during or after the war. The trial also marks the earliest use of photographs in a criminal case in which the death sentence was at stake. Wirtz was convicted and hanged. At this time, photography was still very new to the courtroom. Photographs had previously appeared in forgery cases and to prove identity. Never had they been used in a murder trial. Never had they been asked to illustrate war crimes. The veracity of photography and what seeing a photographic image entails was debated in the courtroom and in newspapers from New York to Louisiana to London. The Wirtz trial is a key moment in the history of photography and in legal evidence that has remained completely overlooked. The very term war crime dates to the same year that the Civil War ended and the trial began, 1865. The trial is the origin for the modern assumption that photography can and even must corroborate the horrors of war. The very notion of atrocity, of war crime, Susan Sontag writes, is associated with the expectation of photographic evidence. From late August through late October of 1865, the Wirtz trial took place in the U.S. Court of Claims building in Washington, with the press offering breathless coverage for all those outside its walls. Given the deplorable conditions and the high death rate at Andersonville, the Northern public was eager to find heroes and villains. As the trial got underway, the Union officer who had arrested Wirtz presented the pistol he had used to arrest him to Clara Barton as a, quote, testimony of the kindness in burying the dead there. Meanwhile, the captain was generally portrayed in text and images as a fiendish man intent on making his captives suffer. A double-page spread in Harper's Weekly depicted Wirtz's deeds based on the charges and witnesses' testimony, as well as drawings entered into evidence during the trial. Meager vines punctuated with thorns like barbed wire surround these portraits of cruelty, a design that recalls the vignettes of emaciated prisoners known as living skeletons, who had appeared on the cover of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper the year before, when federal soldiers were first returning north and facing shocked doctors in the Army hospital at Annapolis. Photographs were taken to document their condition, which were then translated into prints, included in congressional reports, and published widely in newspapers. These are the men who implicitly become martyrs. All who are depicted are white, although African-American soldiers were also imprisoned in Confederate camps, including Andersonville. The POW experience is not illustrated as one shared across race or one that was especially brutal or fatal for Black soldiers. The Wirtz trial used photographs to show the state of both the prison and the white prisoners who had suffered. Judge Advocate and Chief Prosecutor Colonel Norton Parker Chipman introduced views of the prison, most likely those by A.J. Riddle, who had made the only known photographs during the camp's operation, and which picture the dire circumstances of overcrowding and lack of shelter. Portraits of malnourished and diseased soldiers showed the bodily effects, admitted into evidence during the testimonies of doctors who had treated returned prisoners. The admission of photographs into evidence incited discussion and debate, revealed in the handwritten trial transcript from the time housed in the National Archives. Who could confirm the credibility of these photographs? What could photographs be expected to show? And could they deceive? Drawings and sketches, by contrast, provoked no such questions. They were seen as visualizations of eyewitness accounts and admitted into evidence. It was not clear in 1865 what or whose account photography offered in the courtroom. During his testimony for the prosecution, Dr. B.A. Vanderkieft, the surgeon in charge at the military hospital at Annapolis, estimated that he had nearly 2,000 prisoners from Andersonville under his charge, and that, quote, most of the men, I may say all with very few exceptions, arrived in a very destitute condition. At one point, he is shown a photograph. And I should note for people who don't read 19th century handwriting for a living, what looks like a 2 right here is in fact a Q for question, and then that's followed by A for answer. Examine this photograph and state whether it presents a true picture, the lawyer asks the doctor. Yes, sir, a fair picture, Vanderkieft replies, which is to say it was indicative of a common condition. He had seen hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, meaning cases, not photographs, but the conflation is important. The photograph is treated as a body and is representative of many more. The photograph is then put into evidence and marked Exhibit 12. And you give the opinion you have just expressed as a professional opinion? The prosecutor asks. Yes, sir, the doctor replies. Here we see the emergence of the expert witness whose testimony confers legitimacy onto photography. During the cross-examination, the defense counsel attempts to cast doubt on Dr. Vanderkieft as a witness and by proxy on the photograph now marked Exhibit 12. Were you ever captured as a prisoner of war? Yes, sir, but released immediately. You were never then within the lines of the Southern Confederacy? No, sir. You do not know of your own knowledge about the condition of prisoners there. I have not seen them. Then what you have stated in relation to the condition of prisoners there was from hearsay, repeated always in the same way by prisoners captured at different times. All you do know is from hearsay. Yes, sir. Since Dr. Vanderkieft was not himself at the prison camps, the defense counsel suggests that his knowledge about their conditions is from hearsay. Establishing this is essential to setting up doubts about photography and about seeing photographs as a mode of witnessing. Did you see the original of that photograph? The defense attorney asks. Not this one, the doctor replies, but hundreds and hundreds quite the same. Lawyer and witness both continue to elide body and image. Here, the original is not the glass plate negative, but the body itself. Do you know whether the original of that photograph came from Andersonville? I do not know. Then you know nothing about this photograph at all. No, sir, not in this special case, not. You do not know whether it was taken from the original or whether it was made up? I do not know, sir. Having established that the surgeon had neither seen nor treated this particular soldier, the original, the counsel quickly pivots to question the witness's knowledge of the actual production of this photograph. Can a medical doctor tell the court about a photograph? Is he the expert witness with the correct professional experience, as the prosecution attempted to establish? This leads to a bizarre and incredible discussion about the possibility of fabricating a skeleton for the camera, in which the distinction between photograph and human form breaks down entirely. Do you know that such a skeleton as that can be made up without having an original? No, sir, I do not know that. Do you know that one bone can be put together by the side of another and that in that way a skeleton made up and a photograph taken? No, sir, but there is bone and skin here. There is more than bone here. Does it represent a living person? Yes, sir, I think so. You know that in no other way except by seeing it? Yes, sir. The defense lawyer is trying to call into question the veracity of these shocking photographs and their claims as evidence. But what results is an inquiry into the very assumptions that undergird vision. If one sees a photograph, as this physician does in the courtroom, Can one make a claim to know what or who it represents? What kind of seeing constitutes knowledge? The very nature of photography is put under examination in the Wirtz case. Amid a trial generally understood by scholars as a debacle of prosecutorial overreach, fanned by media sensationalism, is a genuinely bracing exploration of the possibilities and limitations of photographs as evidence. While the notion of a fabricated body may seem far-fetched, it is a means for Wirtz's attorney to assert that the man on the stand does not know the man in the photograph. The doctor was not a witness to the soldier's existence, nor to his portrait's production. What can photographs tell us by sight alone? Created months after the Wirtz trial, Relics of Andersonville Prison encapsulates the slippage between photograph and body and the powerful need for such a conflation in the aftermath of the war. The original, to use the language from the defense, may be gone, the body's dead, missing, unidentified. But their relics remain and are given a strange corporeal form in Barton's photograph. One photograph comes to stand for many bodies, for all the unknown and unnamed. In the decades after the war and throughout the 20th century, Andersonville became one of the most contested sites of cultural memory, a place at once synonymous with Northern sacrifice and with Southern lost cause revisionism. In 1909, more than 40 years after the trial of Captain Henry Wirtz, a monument was dedicated to his memory by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Created during a period dense with monument building and marked by racial terror, the 35-foot-high white marble obelisk stands, then as now, in the center of the main street of the tiny town of Andersonville, across the road from the Andersonville National Historic Site and the National Cemetery. This was the culmination of a far-reaching campaign to rewrite the history of Andersonville and the history of the war. The United Daughters of the Confederacy sought a wholesale ideological re-education of white America. The monument was the physical prompt, one part of what they termed the Wirtz movement. This movement would, quote, renew the study of those historic times with a view to get at the real facts that are now hidden beneath tons of public documents, end quote. With historical archives and records as the enemy, the UDC created their own lengthy reports. The core tenets of the lost cause were fully represented. Slavery was ignored or understood as a humane system of labor. Before the Wirtz monument was erected, its location had been the subject of particular contention, not only because of the thousands of Union soldiers who had died and were buried at Andersonville, but also because of the vibrant African American community that had risen there in the wake of the war. In the immediate aftermath of the South's surrender in 1865, the prison became a refugee camp, an island of federal land in southern Georgia where Black men, women, and children could flee their enslavers. A freedmen's school was established the following year in the ruins of the prison hospital building. For generations after, Black Americans worked as caretakers in the Andersonville National Cemetery. These were some of the few jobs that offered them a living wage. A thriving neighborhood arose with 2 churches and many homes, farms, and businesses. Through the Jim Crow era and amidst the rise of white supremacist violence long into the 20th century, residents continued to organize elaborate annual events to celebrate emancipation and honor the dead. But 100 years after the war, many in the community were forced to sell their land to the U.S. Department of the Interior to make way for a national park at Andersonville and later a prisoner of war museum. To find support for the idea in the midst of the civil rights movement, which the state of Georgia adamantly opposed, the National Park Service proposed a broad focus on prisoner experience in history, to use their vague words, and at such camps. There would be no attention paid to African-American experience, whether as the enslaved laborers who built Andersonville, as soldiers imprisoned and tortured there, or as freedmen living and working on the land after the war. These stories of Black soldiers and communities would be silenced. The Verts movement was more than a monument and continues into the present. On Memorial Day in 1915, the Women's Relief Corps of the Grand Army of the Republic, a group of women who supported Union veterans, dedicated their own monument at Andersonville to Clara Barton, who had recently passed away. The stone tablet featured a red cross and below it, a metal plaque honoring her untiring devotion and the great work of preserving the names of those who had died there. It would seem a pointed response to the Verts Memorial, erected just 6 years before, but also one that does not antagonize. Barton's work at Andersonville is smoothed into selfless devotion and ossified as a form of historical preservation. All that is relentlessly difficult about war and its aftermath is gently effaced in the monument. The Clara Barton, who collected strange relic objects and kept them for decades, becomes Clara Barton, the founder of the American Red Cross, that august national organization that exists above partisan sentiments. The monument transforms history into a brief laudatory caption under an iconic symbol. The photograph gathers the evidence of history. May we always carry it with us. Thank you.